Well, hey there, guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're comparing some thin ripping jigs from Amazon. Well, I have shown you guys before here on the show how to make a really easy, quick jig for repeatability when it comes to ripping thin stock. And it's done with the stock on the outside of the blade. But there are jigs available commercially to purchase to do this exact thing. Some are quite expensive, and others, like these ones from Amazon, are not so expensive. So I've got two of them from Amazon, and we're just going to have a look at them today and compare the two and possibly test them out and see how they work. Well, this is the first jig we're going to take a look at, and this one here was listed as a universal jig to fit most table saws. There was no dimensions listed. The reference photos were very vague. It was hard to get a good idea of what you were looking at. And the thing ran for $26. Now, guys, this product is no longer available. I can honestly see why. This jig is what came as the universal thin ripping guide for most table saws. And the first problem that I can see is the size of these T-bolts here at the bottom. These T-bolts are absolutely minuscule, and I honestly don't know what kind of a T-slot or what kind of a slot they would be running in. But for a normal table saw, which in most cases runs a 3/4 inch wide miter slot, these will never work. In fact, T bolts will not work. You need a solid miter bar. So right off the bat, we have a problem here. As well, the actual distance here that this travels, this is your adjustment for the thin strips. If it were to fit in the miter slot, this maximum distance doesn't reach the blade. You know what? Let's take this over to the table saw and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's just pretend for 2.5 seconds that this does fit the miter slot. The adjustable holes here that bring the body or the base of it forward or backwards, this is maxed out. This is as far as it can go. So even if we push this all the way, maxed out here in our miter slot. Let me just adjust this here so it sits flush. There we go. That is maxed out, and I still have about a 3/8 of an inch gap between the front bearings and the table saw blade. So in all honesty, this jig is kind of useless for what its intended purpose is. And it's a real shame because it is really well made. These aluminum bases, it's dead solid. This knob here for locking in your adjustment is dead solid. It's got a double bearing system on the front end that works really, really well. And these these locking jig knobs also work really well, but unfortunately, this is not for any kind of regulation table saw I've ever seen. Maybe for one of those mini ones that they sell on the market, but it's a real shame. I'd really like to get this functional, but for now, it's nothing more than a paperweight. So essentially, when it comes to buying no-name jigs with no dimensions and something listed as fits most table saws, it's a bit of a buyer beware situation. And while this was only $25.99 sort of thing, it is still it's useless in the shop. So let's put that aside for now, and let's look at the other one that I picked up. Now, this one was a little more expensive. This one was $34. However, this one had dimensions. It said that it fit a 3/4 inch miter slot as well as a 3/8 miter slot. And what kind of a tool has a 3/8 inch miter slot as far as table saws goes? I don't know, but either way, it does come with the bar that is interchangeable with this 3/4 one if you want. And the way that this one works is that this bar sits in your 3/4 inch miter slot. And as you tighten down this knob here, this countersink and the bolt that's in it spreads this aluminum bar apart ever so slightly to lock it against the sides of the miter slot. Now, guys, for my liking, this one is a little strange for the markings. I don't even know why they really have the markings on there, in my opinion, because they don't mean anything. You can't set this to say 1 centimeter and expect to cut a 1 centimeter strip, because in order to do that, you would have to have your blade zeroed out here at the 0. And there's no way to do that. If you bring this over to the 0 point, then you are way too far away from the blade. It's just not going to work. And you can adjust this all you want. So there is a way to use this jig and to use the measurements. It's a little hokey, but it works. But the one thing I noticed with this as well, as although this is a single bearing on the one side here, unlike our other one that was a double, it's a one-way bearing. So you can bring your stock in here and have the bearing right along your stock as you're cutting your thin strip, but it will not turn back the other way. I don't know if that is intended as a featherboard sort of thing, because it's too slick to be able to actually stop something, but it does not turn in reverse. It only turns one way, and that is during the feed of your stock. So that's kind of a neat little feature. As well, it has the 2 pointers, top and bottom, which are adjustable to be able to zero it out, and then your tightening knob here on the top. So why don't we take this one over to the table saw? We know that our other one is non-usable, but let's take this over and give it a try and see what we think as far as setting it up and that sort of thing. Okay, so for this jig here, you want to place your 3/4 miter slot bar into your miter slot, and you want to hold it by your base. You don't want to hold it by the ruler part, because you can see here it's going to tip either side. So we're going to hold it down, kind of align our bearing here with our teeth, just slightly like this, and we can somewhat lock it down. Now, guys, what you want to do is that bearing that's here, we're going to slide this forward until the bearing just touches our teeth. So at this point now, what we want to do is set our markers, and we're going to set it so that our markers are lined up on the closest whole number. So depending on what scale you're going to use, metric or imperial, for me, I'm just going to do imperial because it's easier for now, but I'm going to set them both. So you want to loosen off your pointers and line it up and tighten it down for the closest whole number, in this case 8 centimeters, and here 3 inches. So we can now loosen this, bring it back, and let's just say that we want to cut a 1/16 inch strip. We will slide this back away from the blade, line it up with the 1/16, and then having your bearing slightly behind your blade, we're going to tighten this down. Now, I don't know how accurate these rulers are on here. I'm trying to line it up as accurately as I can. I think I'm pretty good there. And guys, I just point this out. This thing is solid. Like, I could probably shift the table saw by moving this jig. That's not going anywhere. So now we just need to get a piece of stock to test cut. So I have a scrap of cherry, and what you want to do is bring your fence over and lock it down so that the stock just kisses your bearing. That looks pretty good there. And what we're going to do is we're going to run this through for a cut, and then we'll measure it and see how close it is to the 1/16. Let's just see what we've got here. We've got 9 1/12 9/28. That's a ridiculous fraction. But it is consistently 9/28 along the strip. So how close is this to 1/16? Well, it's 1/128th away. So it's actually pretty close, and that could be a matter of setup. So what I'd like to see is, yeah, that works great, but I really want to see this one work like that. This jig here, while the other one works really well and it's well made and I like it, this one here is a much more robust jig, and I'd like to try to get this one functional. So let's see if we can do that. Well, I think the very first thing that I want to address is the fact that this does not fit in the miter slot. And I think for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize some UHMW plastic. And this is 3/4 of an inch wide and fits rather tightly in the miter slot. So let's just take this over to the table saw and see, do we actually need to do something to lock this in place? Okay, well, it fits securely in the miter slot. However, while it is a good fit, it's a fairly loose fit, and I have no way to lock it down. Not only that, but this may wear over time. When it comes to a battle between metal and plastic, metal always wins. So the question is, that can be our miter bar, but will it provide us with enough distance to reach our blade? And the answer, if it's mounted on top like this, is absolutely not. We've got the same scenario we had before. However, if I mount it here on the end, you can see that I can now reach my blade. So we have now two problems potentially cured. One of them being a way to mount it to the miter slot, and the other making it so that the distance of our adjustment is able to reach the blade to be able to adjust for a thin strip. So I'm going to cut this to length, and then we're going to have to figure out how to mount it to our jig. Well, before we can attach our UHMW to our jig, we need to address the issue of this thing sliding in the miter slot. So I've placed a center line here, and as well, right in the middle of the length, I've placed a mark and center punched it. We're going to drill a hole here, a 1/4 inch diameter hole about halfway down, and then we're going to do a large countersink at the top. And then once we get that done, we can carry on down through and make this a through hole. Well, you may be wondering, why not just drill the through hole immediately and then countersink it? It's plastic, so I didn't want the bit to be able to deform the plastic. I still wanted to keep as much support of the original form as I could until I got the countersink done. Well, at this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come out from the center on this center line here, about 7/8 of an inch out from the center line. And I'm going to take this over to the scroll saw, and I'm going to cut a slot along that center line to be able to allow the plastic to spread apart. So I'm going to get that cut, and then I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, and the final piece for this is a 1/4 thread bolt, but it needs to have a countersink head on it. That is key to making this work. So you'll place your bolt into the countersink like that. This end protrudes. We can place a washer and then a jig knob over top. And then when this goes into the miter slot, as you tighten this jig knob, it will pull the countersink up into the UHMW plastic, effectively spreading apart that kerf just slightly in order to tighten the connection in the miter slot. Now guys, you might find that when trying to tighten up this jig knob here, in order to get it to fit properly in your miter slot, you might find that this is just spinning. And if that's the case, you can just get a Dremel tool with a little cutoff disc, and you can see here that I have ground a bunch of grooves in this bolt. Well, those grooves serve the purpose of when you're tightening this jig knob those grooves will dig in to that UHMW plastic, and you can tighten it and without a problem keep that bolt from spinning. So there you go. There's just a little bit of advice on how to make this a little more efficient. And that is all it takes to get this solid. So with that done, now we can concentrate on getting this attached to our jig. Well, I've kind of modified this base a little bit. Not a lot, just a little. In the center holes here, I have drilled these out to 5/16 of an inch. The reason for that is I want to fit a nut in here. I don't know if you can see that, how the nut fits inside the 5/16 hole. I've also drilled holes in the end of our base to accommodate some bolts for these nuts so that I can screw them in here and secure our UHMW plastic to our jig base. Obviously, I've also drilled corresponding holes in here to be able to screw the whole thing together. And I've actually counterbored these so that those bolts will sink flush, or recessed, I should say, inside of here. All right, so I'm going to get this UHMW bolted to our jig, and then we can take it over to the table saw and just test that it's going to hold together. Okay, we can place our jig here. We're going to make sure that our base is sitting flush on our table saw table, and it is. We can still move it, but because that's what we haven't tightened this yet. We'll give this a little bit of a tighten. And there we go. That is rock solid in there now. So we now have our base connected to a piece that is very usable in our miter slot. But the problem here, and it's not even really a problem, this jig is usable now as it is, with our sliding piece being able to adjust to our blade. But honestly, you know what, guys? I'd love to see this be marked. I'd like to see some markings here, some kind of measurements, anything. So I'm thinking, I wonder if I could laser engrave this stuff. I know it's aluminum, but I don't know if it'll take an engraving. Maybe I'll do a test engraving on the back here, and we'll just see how we make out. Let's do that. Let's do that. But before I carry on and do any kind of laser engraving on this, what I really wanted was an adjustable marker here. So I actually cut it out of 1/8 inch thick scrap acrylic. I ended up having to cut 2 because the first one, you can probably see it if I hold it up here, I slipped when I was making the registration mark and accidentally scored it in the wrong spot. But in order to make those registration marks, you can just use a square and a sharp awl, and that will scratch very easily on there. You scratch it on the bottom side, guys, not the top. And this was all done at the scroll saw. I just drilled a hole here, a 3/16 through hole, and then I counterbored on the other side, measured the nut for this bolt, and it was actually 3/8 of an inch corner to corner. So I reduced the drill bit size by 1 size, drilled this counterbore, and then just hammered the nut into the aluminum base, and it seated itself perfectly in there. That's not coming out. So this now is adjustable with that slot that I've cut in the registration mark acrylic. I can slide it back and forth to zero out my measurements. So now I've also placed a mark. I sat this in the table saw and I slid this all the way over until it touched the blade, and then placed a pencil mark here roughly where I want my 0 mark to be. Now it's not going to be perfect, but when it comes to the engraving, that's where I want my engraving to start. And depending on the blade that I use, that's why I have this adjustable piece of acrylic. That way I can fine tune it and tweak it depending on the blade and the kerf of the blade that I'm using. So I think in order to get this done, I think we're going to have to head inside, and I'm going to have to get out the Lightburn program, and I think we're going to have to make ourselves a program or an engraving file to engrave some measurements across here. It looks like we're going to want, it looks to be about 2 inches. I think that's going to be our maximum here on this length. So let's head inside and get an engraving file made. Well, I'm here on Lightburn, and what I have done is, instead of going through the whole process of making up a new file, a while back I did a ruler tutorial for Lightburn here on the program, and I've just taken that same program and modified it. Now I've done a test engraving on the back of our jig piece, and I'm happy with the results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to engrave this little 2-inch ruler onto the top of our jig, and then I'll show you what it looks like. And we'll just pull this out and have a look. Wow, that looks absolutely incredible. That's beautiful. Okay, let's put this jig back together and then see if we can take this for a test spin and see if we can't get it to function properly. Well, I have my jig here at the table. I have set the bearings so that it is just kissing the tooth of the blade, and I have adjusted my gauge here to be on the 0. Now, truth be told, I'm a little off of my pencil mark. I would have liked that engraving to be maybe about 1/8 of an inch or more to the left, but it's not that big of a deal. It still works and it still looks great. So at this point, all I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen this off here and adjust it to be at 1/16 of an inch, and then tighten it back down. And then we're going to do a test cut and just see how we make out with this jig. Okay, we'll just check this out. Wow. All right, well, there you go, guys. Repeatability, and we've just turned a dirt cheap jig into a very useful item in the shop. And there you have it, comparing thin strip ripping jigs. Guys, I don't know what happened on today's show. This whole show, or the premise of this show, was for me to get 2 different thin ripping jigs from Amazon and compare them and test them and see how they work, and not necessarily promote them or give them a review, but moreover to let you know that these things are out there and to give you an idea of how they work, or how well or how poorly they work. And then the one jig worked okay and it did a good job, but the other one didn't work at all. And I became so obsessed with making it work because I really liked the quality of the jig, that it kind of morphed into making a bad jig a good jig. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And you know what? I'm okay with the fact that it happened, because I have a really usable jig now that I'm very happy with. Truth be told, the cheaper one that I ended up modifying with the UHMW plastic and the laser engraving and making my own little gauge with the acrylic, I actually like that better than the other one for a couple reasons. Number one, you can lock down the jig and do your adjustments and have it set in that miter slot while you're making those adjustments for fine tuning. Whereas with the other jig, the one that I did not modify, there's a bit of play in that 3/4 inch miter slot bar, and it uses the same tightening mechanism for both the miter slot bar and for the gauge with the bearing on it. So in order to loosen that off, to set your distance, you're loosening off the miter slot bar and giving yourself that play, making it that there's a margin of error to your setting. And while we got lucky and managed to get it set within 1/128th of an inch, that is not the point. The point is there's still that margin of error. Just because I got lucky on that one doesn't mean I'm going to get lucky on the next setup. And you don't want to have to keep setting it up. The whole point of these jigs is repeatability. The other thing that I like about the smaller one as well is the way that the scale runs. On the smaller jig, because I engraved it, as you move the jig further away from the blade, the numbers on the ruler scale, on that 2-inch ruler that I engraved on there, they increase. So you can keep it in your mind as to what size of a thickness of strip that you're cutting. But on the other one, the numbers go the opposite way, and there's really no zeroing it out. You go to the nearest whole number, and then you can just move it left or right to your increments as it goes. I'm not a big fan of that. Maybe it's a little OCD for me, but I actually prefer the smaller jig that we've modified here today. Either way, guys, it's a great way to produce thin strips on your table saw with incredible repeatability, just over and over. You need a whole bunch of 1/32 inch strips or 1/16 or 1/8. You can rip those off with no problem just by setting the jig, checking your settings, test cutting, and then just go, 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 go. And it works well. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. You know what, I'll post the links to one of those jigs today, not the one I modified, because unfortunately, from what I can see, it's no longer even offered on Amazon. But keep in mind, if you are getting a cheaper jig, that you can easily modify it to work for you and save yourself a few bucks along the road. Guys, if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have an amazing audience base, and I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the content. Kind of a weird, that escalated quickly kind of a vibe today, but I hope you're going to give it a try for yourself. Hope you're going to check out these jigs and get one for your shop. And more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another Alternative Tuesday.